The nursery smelled of fresh paint and lavender-scented linen. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating dust motes dancing over a pristine white crib. It was a room of quiet anticipation, a perfect picture of a life about to begin. But the silence was wrong. It was heavy, suffocating. On the meticulously made bed in the master suite, a single sheet of cream-colored stationery lay stark against the grey duvet. 4 lines of elegant, looping script. A gut punch in calligraphy. James Peters read it once, then twice. His pregnant wife was gone, and the note she left behind was a perfectly crafted lie. James Peters's Atherton, California mansion was less a home and more a monument to calculated success. All glass, steel, and unsettling quiet, it overlooked Silicon Valley like a predator watching its territory. He stood in the cavernous living room, the note from his wife, Katrina, trembling slightly in his hand. "My dearest James, I can't do this anymore. The life we've built feels like a cage. I need to find myself again, away from all of this. Please don't look for me." Katrina. To the outside world, it was a tragedy. A sensitive, heavily pregnant woman, overwhelmed by the pressures of a high-profile life. James knew better. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a declaration of war. He dialed 911, his voice a practiced symphony of panic and grief. "My wife. She's pregnant. 8 months pregnant. She's gone." She left a note. Within the hour, the sterile quiet of his home was replaced by the measured footsteps and clipped radio chatter of the Atherton Police Department. Leading the initial inquiry was Detective Bobby Welch, a man whose weary eyes and rumpled suit seemed out of place amidst James's curated perfection. Welch had been a cop long enough to know that grief had a texture, a chaotic, messy signature. James's grief was smooth, polished, like a product ready for market. "Mr. Peters, can you think of any reason why your wife would leave?" Bobby asked, his gaze drifting from James's $1,000 shoes to the cold, abstract art on the walls. "We've been under a lot of stress," James said, pinching the bridge of his nose. He looked every bit the tormented husband. "My company, Aura, is going through a massive expansion. Katrina, she's a private person. The media attention, the galas, it was all becoming too much for her. Was she seeing a doctor for anxiety, depression? She saw her OB-GYN, of course. She was healthy. Happy, I thought." James gestured vaguely around the room. "We had everything. This baby was everything to us." Bobby nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on the nursery he'd just walked through. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. It looked like a catalogue, not a room waiting for a baby. "Did you argue last night?" A flicker of something, annoyance maybe, crossed James's face before being smoothed over. "No, we had dinner. We talked about names." She seemed tired. She went to bed early. A lie. Bobby could feel it in the air, as crisp and artificial as the climate-controlled atmosphere. He'd spent 20 years reading people, and James Peters was a locked book, written in a language of deception. As the forensics team dusted for prints, a formality, as there was no sign of foul play, Bobby walked through the couple's walk-in closet. On one side, rows of James's bespoke Italian suits. On the other, Katrina's clothes, elegant, understated dresses, soft cashmere sweaters. A small, locked jewelry box sat on her vanity. "Mr. Peters, do you have the key for this?" Bobby asked, holding it up. James came to the doorway, his jaw tight. "No, that was hers. Private." Later, after James's lawyer arrived and began hovering protectively, Bobby sat in his unmarked sedan at the base of the long, winding driveway. He pulled out his phone and typed James Peters into the search bar. The first dozen results were about Aura. his revolutionary AI-driven logistics company that had made him a billionaire before 35. Then he added another name, a name he'd overheard one of the younger officers whispering about. Rebecca Hancock. The results were immediate. Tabloid photos from 6 weeks ago. James Peters looking comfortable and intimate, leaving a private Beverly Hills club with Rebecca Hancock, a stunning actress whose career was just beginning to ignite. Her hand was on his arm, her head tilted toward his in a gesture of easy familiarity. The headline read, "Tech Titan's New Muse." Bobby looked back up at the glass house on the hill. A cage, Katrina had called it in her note. He was beginning to understand why. It wasn't the life she was running from. It was the man who had built it. He started his car, a grim certainty settling in his stomach. The search for Katrina Hatfield had just begun, but the investigation into James Peters was already underway. The story exploded. Pregnant wife of Silicon Valley, mogul vanishes. News vans camped outside the gates of the Atherton estate like vultures. Katrina's beautiful, smiling face was splashed across every screen, a stark contrast to the grainy paparazzi shot of her husband that always seemed to run alongside it. James, guided by a team of public relations experts, played his part to perfection. He held a press conference on the steps of his home, his eyes red-rimmed and his voice cracking with emotion. "I only want one thing," he said, his gaze finding a camera in the throng. "For my wife, my beautiful Katrina, to come home safely. Kat, if you can hear me, I love you. Our baby needs you. Please, just let us know you're okay." It was a masterful performance. He was vulnerable, powerful, heartbroken. The public narrative swelled with sympathy for the tragic billionaire. But behind the scenes, the tide was already turning. The photos of James with Rebecca Hancock resurfaced, no longer a buried tabloid whisper, but a cannon blast through his carefully constructed image. The media, smelling blood in the water, began digging. Rebecca's agent issued a terse, "No comment." Rebecca herself went dark, her vibrant social media accounts falling silent. The court of public opinion was now fiercely divided. Was he a grieving husband or a philandering monster whose pregnant wife had finally had enough? Detective Bobby Welch cared about a different court. He sat in his cluttered office, the walls covered in case notes and crime scene photos, a stark contrast to James's minimalist mansion. On the board in front of him, he had 2 photos, Katrina Hatfield beaming at a charity event, and James Peters, his face a mask of public anguish. "He's hiding something," Bobby muttered to his partner, a young, tech-savvy detective named Maria Flores. "The affair seems obvious," Maria said, scrolling through financial records on her tablet. "But his finances are weird, Bobby. Aura's stock is soaring, but there are massive personal cash withdrawals over the last 3 months. We're talking millions, untraceable wire transfers to offshore accounts. Running money," Bobby said, his eyes narrowing. "Is he paying someone off, or building a nest egg to run his own disappearing act? Could be for the girlfriend. Rebecca Hancock's new movie just got a mysterious influx of funding from an anonymous backer. Her career went from B-list to lead role overnight." Bobby leaned back, the old chair groaning in protest. "So he's buying her a career while his pregnant wife sits at home. It's a motive for Katrina to leave, sure. But the note, it's too clean, too simple." He thought of the jewelry box. "Get a warrant for that box, and let's pay Mr. Peters another visit, this time without his lawyer present if we can manage it." Meanwhile, James sat in his home office, the news playing on a silent, wall-mounted screen. His PR chief, a sharp-suited man named Julian, was pacing. "The Rebecca photos are killing us, James. You have to get ahead of it." "It was a mistake," James said, his voice flat and cold, all trace of public grief gone. A meaningless diversion. It doesn't look meaningless. It looks like you were flaunting your mistress while your wife was preparing for your child. James's fist clenched. Katrina knew our marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was a partnership, an arrangement that benefited us both. She was emotional, hormonal. She overreacted. He was spinning a narrative even to his own team. He was testing it out, refining the words he would use to paint Katrina as unstable, unreliable. He was laying the groundwork not just to explain her absence, but to discredit her entirely. Because he knew, with chilling certainty, that the real secret Katrina held had nothing to do with another woman. It was a secret that could destroy his entire empire, a truth buried at the very foundation of Aura. The note wasn't a suicide pact or a lover's lament. It was the opening move in a game he never thought she'd have the courage to play. Bobby Welch found James Peters not in his sterile mansion, but at the gleaming headquarters of Aura in Palo Alto. The building was an architectural marvel of glass and recycled wood, with an indoor waterfall and employees gliding on hoverboards. It felt less like a company and more like a cult of innovation. Bobby, in his rumpled suit, was an immediate anomaly. He was led to James's office, a corner suite with panoramic views that made the world below look like a toy set. James was on a call, his back to the door. He held up a finger, a gesture of dismissal that set Bobby's teeth on edge. After a deliberately long minute, James ended the call and swiveled in his ergonomic chair. "Detective, I was told you were at my home. Thought I'd try your office," Bobby said, remaining standing. He placed a folder on the vast marble desk and slid a photograph out of it. It was the clearest shot of James and Rebecca Hancock laughing together outside the club. "Your wife has been missing for 72 hours. During that time, have you had any contact with Ms. Hancock?" James glanced at the photo as if it were a mildly interesting piece of junk mail. "No. As I'm sure you're aware, my focus has been entirely on finding Katrina." "Right. Your tearful press conference was very convincing," Bobby said, his voice dry. "But you see, it looks bad, James. It paints a picture. Man builds empire, gets wife, gets bored, finds new, younger model. Pregnant wife becomes an inconvenience." The calm on James's face fractured. A muscle in his jaw jumped. "You have no idea what you're talking about. My marriage is none of your business. My only concern is Katrina." "Is it?" Bobby leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. The power dynamic shifted. "Because my concern is that her note mentioned a cage, and this life you built, it looks a lot like one. You control everything, don't you? The company, the narrative, the people. Did you try to control her? Katrina was a free woman. She could do whatever she wanted. Could she? Or was she a part of the corporate image? The supportive, beautiful wife who humanized the ruthless tech genius?" Bobby pushed another file across the desk. "These are the cash withdrawals Maria Flores found. $3 million in the last 2 months. That's a lot of walking around money, James. Was it for Rebecca? A down payment on her silence? Or was it for something else?" James stood up, his height giving him a physical advantage he was used to leveraging. "This is harassment. My lawyers will have your badge for this, detective. You are out of your depth." "Maybe," Bobby conceded, "but I'm a patient man, and things have a way of surfacing." He tapped the photograph of Rebecca. "People talk, especially when they realize they're just a pawn in someone else's game. You should know, your wife's jewelry box, the one you didn't have a key for. We got a warrant. The locksmith opened it in about 30 seconds. James's face went utterly blank. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. "It was empty," Bobby continued, watching him closely, "except for a single small item, a key, not for a door. It looks like a key to a safe deposit box. James's composure shattered. He strode to the door and yanked it open. "Get out! Get out of my office now, or I will have you removed for trespassing." Security guards appeared instantly, large men in sharp suits. Bobby gave a slow, deliberate nod. He had hit a nerve, a big one. The key was the one thing James hadn't anticipated. As Bobby was escorted out, walking past the Zen gardens and kombucha fountains, he knew he was closer than ever. Katrina Hatfield hadn't just run away. She had left a trail. And James Peters wasn't just a cheating husband afraid of a scandal. He was a man terrified of a secret important enough to move millions of dollars for, a secret that was likely hidden in a bank vault, waiting. The rain fell in a relentless, silvery sheet against the window of a small, secluded cabin nestled in the dense forests of Oregon's coast. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a warm glow on Katrina Hatfield. She was not the fragile, broken woman from the news reports. She was calm, focused, and very much in control. Her belly was a prominent, perfect sphere under her wool sweater. She rested a protective hand on it, feeling the gentle kick of her unborn child. This was for you, she thought. All of this. Her escape had been meticulous, planned for over 6 months. She'd used burner phones, cash, and the help of one trusted friend from college who believed in her without question. She had created a new identity, a quiet life in a town where no one knew her face. The TV in the corner was on, the volume low. She watched James's press conference, a bitter smile touching her lips. He was good. So convincing in his grief. He had always been a brilliant performer. Her mind drifted back to the beginning. She'd met James when he was just a driven, brilliant coder with a dream. She'd been there beside him, not just as a partner, but as his first believer. She'd been there when he partnered with his best friend, a gentle genius named Mark. Together, James and Mark were going to change the world with their creation, the algorithm that would become the heart of Aura. But then Mark died. A sudden, tragic hiking accident. James had been devastated, or so he had claimed. He had inherited their shared intellectual property, and, within a year, launched Aura on his own. He became a legend, and Katrina became the billionaire's wife. The lie had been a slow-growing cancer in their marriage. At first, she'd buried her doubts, believing James's story. But small things began to surface. An old email from Mark, expressing fear that James was pushing him out. A stray comment from a former colleague. Then, 6 months ago, while searching for an old photo album in the attic, she had found it. Mark's old laptop, which James had claimed was lost. Charging it up had felt like opening a tomb. On it, she found everything. The original, uncorrupted source code for Aura, time-stamped and credited solely to Mark. She found frantic emails from Mark to his lawyer, documenting James's attempts to steal his work, and the final, chilling entry in his digital journal, dated the day before he died. Confronting James tomorrow at the trailhead, he has to make this right. The realization had crashed down on her. James hadn't just stolen a company. He had, at the very least, created the circumstances for his partner's death and covered it up. The man she loved was a phantom. The house, the money, the life. It was all built on a grave. When she found out she was pregnant, everything crystallized. She could not bring a child into that house of lies. Divorcing him wouldn't be enough. He would crush her, use his power to paint her as unstable, take her child from her. He would bury the truth forever. So she planned. She emptied their joint accounts of her own inheritance money, slowly, carefully. She secured the contents of the jewelry box. Not jewels, but the hard drive from Mark's laptop and the key to a safe deposit box where she had stored notarized copies and a full confession of what she knew. The note she left for James was a masterpiece of misdirection, designed to make him think she'd had an emotional breakdown over his affair with Rebecca Hancock, an affair she'd known about for months and saw only as a symptom of his deeper rot. She picked up a burner phone. It was time for the next move. She dialed the number of a renowned investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, a woman famous for taking down corporate giants. "My name is not important," Katrina said, her voice steady and clear. "But I have information about the foundational technology of Aura. I have proof that James Peters did not create it. He stole it, and I think you'll want to see what I have." She hung up before they could trace the call. The first stone had been thrown. The tidal wave was coming. The Wall Street Journal article landed like a precision-guided bomb. It wasn't a speculative piece filled with anonymous sources. It was a surgical takedown. The front page screamed, "Aura's origins questioned. Sources provide evidence tech mogul. James Peters built empire on stolen code." The article laid out a damning, albeit still partial, timeline. It detailed the core algorithm of Aura and presented technical analyses suggesting it was identical to a project developed by Peters's late partner, Mark. It didn't name Katrina, referring only to a source close to the company's origins. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. By the time the stock market opened, Aura's stock was in freefall. It plummeted 40% in the first hour of trading. Billions of dollars in market value evaporated into thin air. James's carefully crafted world, already stressed by the scandal of his missing wife, was now imploding. He stood in his office, staring at the blood-red ticker on his screen, his face a mask of cold fury. This wasn't happening. He had been so sure the problem was the affair, the emotional fallout of a broken marriage. He had prepared for that, planned to spin Katrina as a scorned, unstable woman. But this was an attack on the very core of his identity, his legacy. She had outmaneuvered him completely. The note, the disappearance. It was all a brilliant feint. She hadn't broken down, she had set a trap. "Julian!" he roared, and his PR chief scurried into the office, his face pale. "We're drafting a statement," Julian stammered. "Deny everything. Slanderous lies, corporate espionage from a competitor. Find her!" James slammed his fist on the marble desk, the sound echoing in the silent room. "This has her fingerprints all over it. She's the only one who could have known. Find her!" His paranoia, once a low hum, was now a screaming siren. He saw enemies everywhere. He trusted no one. His first call was to Rebecca Hancock. She answered on the second ring, her voice a nervous flutter. "James? I saw the news. It's horrible. Did you talk to anyone?" he demanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. "What? No. Of course not. I've been hiding from the paparazzi just like you told me to. Don't lie to me, Rebecca. That Detective Welch. Did he contact you? Did you say anything?" "He left a card with my doorman, but I didn't call him back," she said, her voice rising in panic. "James, you're scaring me." "You should be scared," he snarled. "Your career, that little movie I financed for you, it can all disappear. I made you. I can unmake you. Stay quiet. Don't talk to anyone. Do you understand me?" He hung up, leaving her in stunned silence. The mask was off. The charming, powerful benefactor was gone, replaced by a cold, threatening tyrant. Rebecca stood in her sterile, rented Hollywood condo, a gilded cage of her own, and felt a profound chill. She had aligned herself with James for the power, for the boost to her career. She had rationalized the affair, telling herself it was just a game powerful people played, but this was different. The threat in his voice was real. She looked at the news, at the crumbling empire, at the face of the missing, pregnant Katrina Hatfield. For the first time, she didn't see a rival. She saw a victim, or worse, a woman who had been pushed so far she had to burn down the world to escape. Rebecca thought about the nights she'd spent at James's house, the way he would sometimes talk in his sleep, muttering the name Mark. She remembered seeing him once, late at night in his office, staring at a framed photo of himself and another man, his face contorted with something she couldn't decipher then, but now recognized as a toxic mix of guilt and rage. She walked over to her purse and pulled out the crumpled business card Detective Welch had left. His number was printed in stark black ink. She had a choice to make. Go down with James's sinking ship or grab the only life raft in sight. Her hand trembled as she unlocked her phone. Detective Bobby Welch was nursing a lukewarm coffee at his desk when his phone buzzed. Private number. He almost ignored it, but a hunch made him answer. Welch. Is this Detective Welch? The voice was hesitant, strained. The one investigating the disappearance of Katrina Hatfield? It is. Who's this? A pause. My name is Rebecca Hancock. Bobby sat bolt upright. This was the break he'd been waiting for. Miss Hancock, I'm glad you called. I'd very much like to talk to you. Not on the phone, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Can we meet? Somewhere private. I think I'm in trouble. They met an hour later at a nondescript diner in Daly City, halfway between her world and his. She was huddled in a corner booth, wearing a baseball cap and dark sunglasses, looking less like a glamorous actress and more like a hunted animal. He threatened me, she began, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. James, after the article came out, he called and said he could unmake me. He sounded unhinged. What are you afraid of, Rebecca? Bobby asked gently. I don't know, but it's more than just his company failing. There's something darker. He was obsessed with his late partner, Mark. He talked about him sometimes. He'd say things like, Mark didn't have the stomach for what it takes to win. He said Mark was weak. Bobby leaned in. Did you ever see anything? Hear anything specific? Rebecca's eyes welled with tears. I thought it was just business. I didn't want to know the details. But one night, I was at his house. He was in a meeting, and I was waiting in his office. I saw documents on his screen. Legal papers. It was a settlement with Mark's widow, a ridiculously small amount, signed just after his death, and there was another file open next to it. It looked like a geology report. It mentioned unstable shale and rock slide risk at the exact location where Mark had his accident. Bobby felt a jolt. This was it, the missing piece. It elevated the case from corporate theft to potential homicide. He saw me looking, Rebecca continued, her voice trembling. He didn't say anything, just closed the laptop. But the way he looked at me, it was cold. Like I was an object, a liability. I think Katrina must have seen that look 1,000 times. I think that's why she ran. We need proof, Rebecca. Can you testify to this? She looked down at her hands. Her career was likely over either way. She could be the homewrecker mistress who stood by a monster, or she could be the woman who helped bring him down. It wasn't a difficult choice. Yes, she said, her voice firming with resolve. But I want protection. I want immunity for any potential complicity. I was a fool, detective, but I'm not a criminal. I can talk to the DA, Bobby promised. You're doing the right thing. As Rebecca recounted every detail she could remember, Bobby's phone buzzed again. It was a text from an encrypted number, forwarded through a lawyer he'd been in touch with, Katrina's lawyer. The message was simple. Safe deposit box, First National Bank of Palo Alto, box 703. The key is in evidence. The original hard drive is inside. Use it to give Mark's widow the justice she deserves. Checkmate. Katrina had provided the weapon. Rebecca had just provided the motive and the means to connect it directly to James. The empire wasn't just crumbling anymore. Bobby Welch was about to level it. He looked at Rebecca Hancock, a woman he had initially dismissed as a shallow opportunist. He saw now that she, too, was a survivor of James Peters. They were an unlikely alliance, two women from opposite ends of James's life, coming together to ensure his downfall. The federal warrant was executed with quiet, brutal efficiency. At 9 a.m., a fleet of black SUVs descended on the Aura campus. FBI agents, their jackets emblazoned with bold yellow letters, swarmed the glass and steel building. Employees froze at their desks, their kombuchas and ergonomic chairs forgotten as the reality of the raid set in. James Peters was in his glass-walled office, on a frantic conference call with his board of directors, trying to stop the financial bleeding. He was promising a counter-offensive, a lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal, a narrative of corporate sabotage. He was still performing, still trying to control the story. He didn't see them coming until the door to his office swung open. It wasn't his assistant. It was two FBI agents, their faces grim and impassive. And behind them, standing in the doorway, was Detective Bobby Welch. The call with the board went silent. James slowly lowered the phone to its cradle. He looked at the agents, then his eyes locked on Bobby's. In that instant, all the bravado, all the arrogance, drained away. He saw no triumph in Bobby's face, only a quiet, weary finality. He understood. He had been completely and utterly beaten. "James Peters," one of the agents said, his voice echoing in the suddenly cavernous office. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice in connection with the death of Mark Sallow." The click of the handcuffs was a small, sharp sound in the cathedral of his ambition. As they led him out, he was forced to perform a perp walk through the open-plan office, past the faces of the hundreds of employees whose careers he had just destroyed. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, confusion, and betrayal. The cult of innovation had lost its leader. The evidence was overwhelming. The original hard drive from Mark's laptop, recovered from Katrina's safe deposit box, was the smoking gun for the intellectual property theft. Rebecca Hancock's testimony provided the crucial link to the cover-up of Mark's death, corroborated by the geology reports and financial settlements the FBI unearthed in their deep dive. They even found the expert James had paid to author the misleading report on the unstable shale, who quickly folded under pressure. James's lawyers tried to fight, to delay, to spin. They attempted to paint Katrina as a vindictive spouse and Rebecca as a scorned lover, two women colluding to destroy a great man. But the evidence was too clean, too digital, too absolute. In the interrogation room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, James finally broke. But it wasn't a confession born of remorse. It was a tirade of narcissistic rage. "She was nothing without me," he hissed, his face blotchy and red. "I gave her everything. That house, that life, it was all mine. And Mark, he didn't have the vision. He would have sat on that code for a decade, perfecting it. I took it and I built an empire. I did what he was too weak to do." Bobby Welch watched from behind the one-way glass, a sense of profound sadness washing over him. James felt no guilt, only the fury of being caught. He wasn't sorry for what he did, only that he had lost. He saw people not as human beings, but as assets or liabilities. Mark was a liability. Rebecca was an asset, then a liability. And Katrina was the asset who had learned how to fight back, who had liquidated his entire kingdom to save herself and her child. The glass cage was shattered, and its king was finally being brought to account. 9 months later, the Oregon autumn was a riot of gold and crimson. In a modest but comfortable house overlooking a quiet river, Katrina Hatfield rocked her 3-month-old daughter, Lily. The morning light streamed into the cozy living room, illuminating the happy clutter of a new baby. The news of James's trial had been a distant rumble of thunder. He had been found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Aora had been dismantled, its assets sold off to competitors. His name, once a synonym for genius, was now a cautionary tale of hubris and greed. Katrina had followed the proceedings through her lawyer, but she hadn't attended. Her focus was here, in this new life she had built from the ashes of the old one. She had her baby, her freedom, and her peace. There was a gentle knock on the door. Katrina opened it to find a woman in her late 50s, with kind, tired eyes and silver-streaked hair. It was Sarah Sallow, Mark's widow. They had spoken on the phone, but had never met in person. "Katrina," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, please come in." They sat together on the sofa, Lily cooing softly in her bassinet nearby. Sarah held a large envelope in her hands. "This came yesterday," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "The first payment from the civil suit. Because of the evidence you saved. The lawyers said it's one of the largest intellectual property settlements in history. My husband, his name has been cleared. Everyone knows what he created, what was stolen from him." Tears streamed down her face. "For years I believed it was an accident. I grieved the man, but I never knew I also had to grieve his life's work. You gave that back to me, to my children. There are no words to thank you." Katrina took her hand. "I only did what was right. I couldn't let my child be raised on that money, in that house. It was all poison." "You are so strong," Sarah whispered, looking from Katrina to the sleeping baby. "To do all that while pregnant, to risk everything." "I learned that strength is quiet," Katrina replied, a soft smile on her face. "It's not about building empires. It's about protecting what truly matters." After Sarah left, Katrina stood on her porch, breathing in the crisp, clean air. She wasn't a billionaire's wife anymore. She was just a mother in a small house with a future that was entirely her own. She had faced betrayal and psychological warfare from the man she once loved. She had navigated a world of immense power imbalance and emerged not just intact, but victorious. Rebecca Hancock had found her own form of redemption. She gave a series of candid interviews, not to glamorize her story, but to speak about ambition, manipulation, and moral compromise. She went back to acting in small, independent films, choosing art over fame, and slowly rebuilding her career on her own terms. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the river, Katrina held Lily close. Her daughter represented a new beginning, a life free from the dark legacy of James Peters. This was her empire now, a legacy of truth, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. She had not only escaped the cage, she had found that she had the strength to build her own world, a world filled with light. In the end, it wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Katrina didn't just expose a lie, she restored a stolen legacy, secured her child's future, and reclaimed her own soul from the gilded cage she'd been trapped in. She proved that true power isn't measured in billions of dollars or towering skyscrapers, but in the courage to speak the truth and the resilience to build a new life founded on dignity and love. Her story is a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming betrayal, the human spirit can find its way back to the light, stronger and wiser than before. If this story of strength and redemption resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with others who might find inspiration in Katrina's journey. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories about real-life complexities and the power of second chances.
The city hummed, a distant, mechanical heartbeat that never truly slept. But here, atop the glittering penthouse of the Ethelred Tower, the world was muted, replaced by the soft clink of crystal and the murmur of money and old names. This was Maximus Blackwood's world, a kingdom of chrome and glass he had built with his own 2 hands. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette against the sprawling tapestry of lights below, a glass of amber whiskey hanging from his fingers. To anyone watching, he was the picture of success. Impeccable suit, sharp jawline, a gaze that could silence a boardroom. But his eyes, a stormy gray, held a quiet emptiness, a hollow space that all the wealth and power in the world had failed to fill. These parties were a necessary evil, a part of the machine, and he moved through them like a ghost, polite, charming, but utterly detached. Down in the bustling kitchens, a different kind of energy thrived, one of controlled chaos and steam. Valeria Rossi tightened the apron around her waist, the crisp white fabric a stark contrast to her simple black dress. She tucked a stray curl of dark hair behind her ear, her mind already calculating the night's potential tips. This job, though exhausting, was a stepping stone. Every tray she carried, every glass she polished, was a coin in the jar for her dream, a small, sunlit art studio where she could paint and teach. She was beautiful, but in a way the polished guests upstairs would never recognize, a natural, untouched beauty with warm, expressive brown eyes and a smile that came easily, though it had been more guarded lately. A past heartache had left its mark, a faint scar on her spirit that made her cautious. The head caterer, a flustered woman named Brenda, shoved a heavy tray laden with delicate champagne flutes into Valeria's hands. The VIP circle on the main terrace, Rossi. And for heaven's sake, don't drop it. That's Lord Ashworth's personal order. Costs more than your car. Valeria nodded, swallowing a retort. She took a steadying breath, hoisted the tray onto her shoulder, and pushed through the swinging doors into the roar of the party. The transition was always jarring. From the hot, honest clamor of the kitchen to the cool, artificial chill of the penthouse. The air smelled of expensive perfume, fine leather, and ambition. She weaved through the crowd, a silent ship navigating a sea of silk and self-importance. Her feet, in sensible black shoes, ached in protest. Her eyes were fixed on her destination, the open terrace doors where a smaller, more exclusive group had gathered. Meanwhile, Maximus had grown weary of the same old conversations. A business associate was droning on about market fluctuations, and the words blurred into a meaningless hum. Needing a moment, he turned from the window and began making his way toward the same terrace, seeking a breath of real air, away from the recycled, air-conditioned atmosphere. It happened in a split second, a perfect, cruel alignment of the universe. A boisterous man in a too-tight tuxedo stepped back suddenly to emphasize a point, bumping hard into Valeria just as she was passing. The impact was jarring. Her balance, already precarious under the weight of the tray, vanished. Time seemed to slow, stretching into a long, painful moment. The tray tilted. Flutes filled with bubbling golden liquid slid, as if in a dream, towards the edge. Valeria's hands flailed, grabbing at nothing but air. Her eyes widened in pure, undiluted horror. The crash was spectacular. A symphony of shattering crystal that cut through the party's murmur like a gunshot. Icy champagne and sharp shards exploded onto the immaculate polished floor and, more catastrophically, onto the suit of the man who had just stepped into the path of the disaster. A deathly silence fell over the immediate area. All eyes turned to the scene. The boisterous man mumbled an apology and melted into the crowd, leaving Valeria to face the consequences alone. She stood frozen, her empty hands still held out, her face as pale as the moon. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. Her job, her tips, her dream, all washing away in a river of expensive champagne. Trembling, her vision blurring with unshed tears of humiliation, she forced her gaze upward to face the victim. Her mouth was dry as dust. I'm so sorry, sir. She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. It was an accident. Please. Her eyes finally met his. And the world stopped. Maximus Blackwood looked down at the ruin of his $2,000 suit. The cold, wet fabric was plastered to his chest, the smell of alcohol sharp in his nostrils. A lesser man would have erupted. He was known for his icy temper in business negotiations. But as he prepared to deliver a cold, cutting remark, his eyes lifted to the woman standing before him. He saw the mortification etched on her face. He saw the way her bottom lip trembled ever so slightly. And then he saw her eyes. They were a deep, warm brown, like rich earth after a rain, and in them he saw not just fear but a profound, intelligent shame. They were the most honest, real eyes he had seen in years. The angry words died in his throat. His breath caught. His mind, usually a whirlwind of strategies and calculations, went utterly, completely blank. He was speechless. He wasn't looking at a clumsy waitress. He was looking at a person, a beautiful, terrified person, and a strange, powerful feeling, one he hadn't felt in a decade, stirred deep within his chest. It was a feeling that had no place in this cold, calculated world of his. Valeria saw his expression change. She saw the anger drain from his face, replaced by a look of, what was it? Not anger. Not even annoyance. It was a look of profound, stunned confusion. It was the last reaction she expected. Her own fear was momentarily overshadowed by a wave of confusion so strong it made her dizzy. Why wasn't he yelling? Why was he just staring? Please, she begged again, the word a soft, broken plea, though she no longer knew what she was begging for. Forgiveness? Mercy? Or for him to stop looking at her in a way that made her feel so completely and utterly seen? Maximus finally found his voice, but it wasn't the cold, commanding tone he used on his employees. It was softer, lower, almost a murmur meant only for her. It's all right, he heard himself say, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. It's just a suit. A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through the onlookers. The great Maximus Blackwood brushed off like it was nothing? Brenda, the caterer, materialized, her face a mask of panic. Mr. Blackwood. I'm so sorry. Valeria, what have you done? Clean this up at once. But Maximus didn't even look at Brenda. His gaze was still locked on Valeria. He saw the tears she was bravely fighting back. He saw the strength it took for her to stand there and not crumble. He saw a story in her eyes that he desperately wanted to read. Valeria, under the intensity of his stare, could take no more. The confusion, the embarrassment, the strange electric charge in the air between them, it was too much. With a choked sob, she whispered, I'm sorry, one last time, then turned and fled, pushing her way through the stunned crowd, back towards the safety and anonymity of the kitchen, leaving a trail of shattered crystal and a bewildered billionaire in her wake. Maximus stood motionless in the middle of the mess, the champagne slowly soaking through his shirt, cold and sticky. He ignored Brenda's frantic apologies. He ignored the whispers. He simply stared at the space where she had been, the ghost of her warm brown eyes burned into his memory. The hollow feeling inside him was gone, replaced by a new, urgent and entirely unfamiliar need. A need to find her. To know her name. To hear her voice again. The party, his guests, his ruined suit, it all faded into meaningless noise. The only thing that was real was the echo of her plea and the haunting beauty of a woman who had, in a single chaotic moment, cracked the perfect, lonely shell of his world. The silence in Maximus's penthouse after the last guest had been ushered out was profound. It was a different silence than the one he was accustomed to. Usually, it was a hollow, empty quiet, a void he filled with work or the distant city sounds. Tonight, it was a charged, humming silence, filled with the phantom echo of shattering crystal and the lingering image of a pair of terrified, beautiful brown eyes. He had dismissed his staff, refusing their help, and now stood alone in the vast living room, having shed the ruined jacket and waistcoat. The white dress shirt clung to his skin, still damp and smelling faintly of champagne, a tangible reminder of the collision. He poured himself another whiskey, not the expensive stuff he served his guests, but a cheaper, rougher brand he kept for nights when the walls felt like they were closing in. He took a long swallow, the burn doing little to sear away the memory. He replayed the moment in his mind, frame by frame. The initial shock of the cold liquid, the immediate flare of irritation, and then, the sight of her. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful in a way that was entirely natural and uncontrived. It was the raw, undisguised emotion on her face. In his world, people wore masks of politeness, ambition, or sycophancy. They never showed their true feelings, their fear, their shame. She had shown everything. It was the most real interaction he'd had in years, and it had left him feeling strangely exposed. For 3 days he was a ghost in his own empire. He sat through board meetings, his body present but his mind light years away. He signed documents without reading them. His assistant, a sharp, perceptive woman named Anya, noticed the change immediately. Is everything all right, Mr. Blackwood? You seem distracted. He had merely grunted in response, a non-answer that confirmed her suspicions. The image of the woman, the way she had whispered "please, not again," haunted him. What had she meant by "not again"? What past hurt had her mind immediately flashed back to in that moment of public humiliation? The question gnawed at him, an unsolved equation in a life he had built on having all the answers. He couldn't rely on the caterer. Brenda had been too terrified to provide anything but incoherent apologies. Instead, he turned to the one detail that stood out, a small, colorful smudge on the cuff of his ruined shirt that he had initially mistaken for champagne. Upon closer inspection, it was paint. A tiny dry daub of cobalt blue oil paint. She was a painter. It was a thread, a fragile lead in a city of millions. He tasked his security team, not with a corporate espionage case, but with finding a woman who worked for a catering company and was also an artist. It felt both absurd and utterly necessary. Meanwhile, Valeria had spent the same 3 days in a state of nervous dread. She had been certain she would be fired, and when the call from the catering agency never came, her anxiety only morphed into a different, more confusing form. The memory of Maximus's face, the lack of anger, the stunned, searching look in his gray eyes, replayed in her mind on a loop. It was so different from the reaction she had braced for, from the reaction she had received years before from another man in a suit. She tried to bury herself in her work, in the one place that was truly hers. A small, rented studio space in a less fashionable part of the city, shared with 2 other artists. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting smells of turpentine and linseed oil. Here, surrounded by her canvases, vibrant, emotional landscapes and portraits that seemed to hold entire stories in their brushstrokes, she felt in control. She was adding the final highlights to a painting of a stormy sea, channeling her own inner turmoil onto the canvas, when the bell on the studio door chimed. She called out, "We're open. Feel free to look around." Without turning, her focus on the crest of a wave, Maximus stepped into the studio. The transition from the gleaming, ordered world of his high-rise to this chaotic, colorful space was as jarring as it had been for Valeria at his party. Canvases leaned against every wall, sculptures occupied dusty corners, and the air was a symphony of creative disorder. And then he saw her. She was standing with her back to him, dressed in jeans splattered with a rainbow of old paint and a simple white t-shirt. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, a few curls escaping to frame her neck. In her hand was a paintbrush, not a tray of champagne flutes. This was her, stripped of the uniform in her natural habitat. His breath hitched. He didn't speak at first. He walked slowly, his expensive leather shoes silent on the concrete floor, and looked at the paintings. They were powerful, full of emotion and movement. They were nothing like the sterile, expensive art that decorated his offices. This art had a soul. His eyes fell upon one particular piece, a smaller canvas tucked in a corner. It was a portrait of a lone figure standing at a window looking out at a cityscape, their back to the viewer. The feeling of isolation it conveyed was so profound, so familiar, it felt like a punch to his gut. Valeria, feeling a presence, finally turned. The paintbrush slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. All the color drained from her face. He was here. He had found her. The man from the party. He looked even more imposing in this small space, his well-tailored coat and crisp trousers a stark contrast to the artistic chaos around him. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her mind catapulted back to another time, another man tracking her down after a perceived slight. Her hand flew to her throat. How did you find me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Maximus saw the sheer terror in her eyes, a terror that went far beyond the embarrassment of spilling a drink. It was a deep, ingrained fear. He took a careful step forward, his hands held slightly away from his body in a gesture he hoped was non-threatening. "The paint?" he said softly, his voice low. "There was paint on my shirt." I asked around. Her eyes darted towards the door, calculating an escape. She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her look heartbreakingly young. "Look, if this is about the suit, I can pay you back. It will take me some time, but I can set up a payment plan. Just, please, don't make a scene." Her voice broke on the last word. "Please? Not again." There it was. That phrase. The one that had haunted him. It confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't about a ruined suit. This was about an old wound. "Not again," he repeated, his voice still quiet, like he was trying to calm a spooked animal. "That's what you said at the party? What happened before, Valeria?" He used her name, which he had learned from the studio's landlord, and the sound of it on his lips felt both intimate and right. Hearing her name from him shocked her into stillness. She stared at him, really looked at him, past the expensive clothes and the powerful aura. She saw the intensity in his gray eyes, but it wasn't anger or cruelty. It was curiosity. A deep, genuine curiosity. The knot of fear in her chest began to loosen, just a fraction. His name was Thomas, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She hadn't spoken his name in years. He was wealthy, charming. I thought he loved me. But at a party much like yours, I tripped and spilled a tray of food. He was so embarrassed. He laughed. He called me a clumsy fool in front of everyone. He told me I would never fit into his world. She hugged herself tighter, her gaze dropping to the floor. He made me feel so small. So worthless. Maximus listened, his body rigid. A cold fury began to simmer in his veins, not at her, but at this phantom, this Thomas who had taken a vibrant, talented woman and made her afraid of her own shadow. He understood now. Her "please not again" was a plea to not be humiliated, to not be made to feel small, ever again. He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. He was close enough now that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a stark contrast to the smell of paint. "Look at me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Hesitantly, she lifted her gaze to his. "I am not Thomas," Maximus said, each word deliberate and weighted. "The suit was just fabric. It's meaningless. I came here today not because of a spilled drink, but because I haven't been able to stop thinking about the woman who spilled it. I haven't been able to forget your eyes." Valeria felt the truth of his words sink into her, warm and startling. He wasn't here for revenge or repayment. He was here for her. The realization was so overwhelming, so contrary to all her defenses, that a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. Maximus saw the tear and, acting on an impulse he didn't fully understand, he reached out. He didn't touch her face. Instead, his fingers gently brushed against the dried fleck of cobalt blue paint on the back of her hand. The contact was electric, a simple touch that felt more intimate than any kiss she could remember. It was a connection, skin to skin, artist to admirer, man to woman. "I'm Maximus," he said, his thumb stroking a slow, gentle circle on her skin. "And I would very much like to know the woman who paints storms and lonely figures at windows. If you'll let me." In that moment, standing in her messy studio, with the scent of turpentine and his expensive cologne mingling in the air, Valeria felt the heavy, locked door around her heart creak open. The fear was still there, a quiet whisper, but it was being drowned out by a new, terrifying and exhilarating feeling, hope. She looked down at his hand on hers, then back up into his earnest, stormy eyes, and she made a choice. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with a newfound strength. "My name is Valeria." The agreement in the studio was a fragile thing, a tentative bridge built over a chasm of past hurt and present suspicion. For Valeria, the days that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of her, the part that had been shaped by Thomas's cruelty, screamed that this was a mistake, a path that led only to a more profound and devastating humiliation. That voice warned her that a man like Maximus Blackwood, a titan of industry, could not possibly see anything in a struggling artist beyond a momentary curiosity, a fleeting distraction from his world of power and spreadsheets. But another part, a part she had thought long buried, listened to the memory of his voice, so firm and yet so gentle, and felt the ghost of his touch on her hand, a touch that had been respectful, almost reverent. That part of her was dangerously, irresistibly curious. Maximus, for his part, was navigating uncharted territory. His entire adult life had been a series of calculated moves, of strategic acquisitions and dominated negotiations. Courtship, for him, had always been a similarly transactional affair, a dance with women from his own social stratum who understood the unspoken rules. This was different. Valeria was a foreign country with a language he did not speak and customs he did not understand. He knew that a single misstep, a single gesture that could be construed as condescending or entitled, would shatter the delicate trust he had managed to establish. He had to proceed not as a billionaire but simply as a man. Their first meeting outside the studio was deliberately, painstakingly simple. He did not take her to a Michelin-starred restaurant where the cutlery would confuse her and the patrons would judge her. Instead, he showed up at her studio one late afternoon, having changed out of his suit into dark jeans and a simple, well-fitting sweater. He looked younger, less like a CEO and more like a man. "I thought we could go for a walk," he had said, his hands tucked into his pockets. "There's a park nearby with a food cart that sells the best hot chocolate in the city. If you'd like." It was so normal, so unassuming that Valeria could only nod in agreement. They walked through the park as the autumn leaves crunched under their feet, the setting sun casting long golden shadows. They talked. Not about stock portfolios or corporate mergers, but about childhood memories, favorite books, and dreams that had nothing to do with balance sheets. Valeria told him about growing up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs but always made sure there were art supplies waiting for her after school. She spoke of the visceral need to create, to translate the feelings inside her onto a canvas. Maximus, in turn, found himself speaking of things he never discussed. The loneliness of being sent to boarding school at a young age, the immense pressure of building an empire from nothing, the hollow feeling of arriving at a summit only to find no one there to share the view with. He listened to her with an intensity that was both unnerving and flattering. When she spoke about her art, his eyes never left her face, absorbing every word as if it were a vital piece of intelligence. He asked questions not to test her but to truly understand. "What does the color red feel like when you're painting?" he once asked, and the question was so unexpectedly profound that it left her speechless for a moment before she attempted an answer. He was deconstructing the world she lived in, learning its grammar, and in doing so he was making her feel that her world was important, that it mattered. Their time together became a series of these small, profound discoveries. He took her to a dusty old bookstore that smelled of paper and history, and they spent an hour pulling out random novels and reading the first paragraph aloud to each other, laughing at the terrible ones and falling silent at the beautiful ones. She, in return, gave him his first painting lesson in her studio. He was comically bad at it, his large, capable hands that could command a global company becoming clumsy and uncertain with a slender paintbrush. He kept mixing the colors into a muddy brown, a frown of deep concentration etched on his face. Valeria finally laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that lit up her entire face. She came up behind him and gently placing her hand over his, guided his strokes. "Like this," she said softly, her breath warm near his ear. "It's not about force. It's about feeling." The contact sent a jolt through both of them. For a long moment they stood perfectly still, her front pressed against his back, her hands still covering his. The air in the studio grew thick and warm, charged with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. It was a tension of shared glances that lasted a second too long, of accidental brushes of fingers when passing a coffee cup, of a silence that was more eloquent than any words. The shift happened one evening at his penthouse. He had cooked for her, a simple pasta dish that was surprisingly good. They had talked for hours, the city lights twinkling below them like a fallen galaxy. The conversation eventually lulled, settling into a comfortable quiet. They were standing by the same window where he had stood the night they met, but the man looking out now was fundamentally different from the lonely figure of that memory. Valeria looked up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The fear was still there, a faint echo, but it was now overwhelmed by a stronger, more powerful emotion. She saw the way he looked at her, not with possession or lust, but with a kind of awe, as if she were a rare and precious masterpiece. She saw the respect in his actions, the patience in his pursuit. He had dismantled her defenses not with grand gestures, but with quiet consistency and a profound, demonstrated understanding of who she was. "Maximus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned from the window, his stormy gray eyes finding hers in the reflected city light. He saw the question in her gaze, the surrender, the trust. He lifted a hand and slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked the curve of her cheekbone, a touch so tender it made her breath catch. He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. Was a question. A request for permission. Valeria answered by rising onto her toes, her eyes fluttering closed. The kiss was not a collision but a homecoming. It was gentle and searching at first, a soft exploration that held the weight of all their shared conversations and unspoken understandings. It was a kiss that spoke of patience, of a connection that had been built layer by careful layer. Then it deepened, the initial tenderness giving way to a rising tide of passion that had been carefully banked for weeks. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her firmly against the solid strength of his body, and her hands came up to tangle in the hair at the nape of his neck. It was a kiss that tasted of red wine and promise, of a future that was suddenly brilliantly possible. It was a kiss that sealed a pact, a silent vow that the ghosts of the past were finally, truly being laid to rest. In the warm, safe circle of his arms, with the silent, glittering city as their witness, Valeria felt not like she was fitting into his world, but that they were, together, creating an entirely new one. The kiss was not an end but a beginning. It was the unlocking of a door, and on the other side lay a landscape of profound and terrifying intimacy. The careful, polite distance that had characterized their early interactions evaporated, replaced by a raw and consuming closeness that left them both breathless. In the days and weeks that followed, Maximus's penthouse, once a monument to sterile luxury, transformed. Canvases leaned against the minimalist furniture, the scent of oil paint and turpentine now mingling with the aroma of the coffee they shared in the mornings. A vibrant, unfinished landscape of Valerius sat on an easel by the window, a splash of wild, emotional color against the ordered gray of the city skyline. It was no longer just his space, it was their sanctuary. Their physical relationship deepened with a slow, burning intensity that was as much about emotional discovery as it was about passion. The first time she stayed the night, the act of love was not a frantic collision but a slow, whispered conversation. In his bedroom, with the city lights casting soft patterns on the walls, there was a reverent hesitation. He undressed her not with hurried hands, but with a painter's deliberation, his gaze tracing the lines of her body as if committing her to memory. His touch was a question and her responses were his answers. When he finally entered her, it was with a stifled groan that was her name, a sound that spoke of a hunger finally, mercifully, being sated. For Valeria it was a reclamation. The insecurities that Thomas had carved into her soul were gently soothed away by Maximus's worshipful hands and husked affirmations. "You are so beautiful," he would murmur against her skin, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond desire, and for the first time she truly believed it. Their lovemaking was a language of its own, a silent, powerful dialogue where every sigh, every tremble, every clutching of hands spoke volumes of trust, surrender, and a love that was steadily rooting itself in the deepest parts of their beings. This new intimacy bled into the quiet, mundane moments that followed, moments that felt more sacred than any grand gesture. Waking up tangled together, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. The way he would wordlessly bring her a cup of tea exactly as she liked it while she was lost in a painting. The comfortable silence that would fall between them as they read on the sofa, her feet tucked under his thigh. He learned the landscape of her body not just in passion, but in peace. The small scar on her knee from a childhood fall, the way she hummed absently when she was concentrating, the specific curve of her smile when she looked at him first thing in the morning. He was collecting these details, these precious, ordinary fragments of her, and building a new reality with them. It was within this new, secure fortress of their love that Valeria's dream of her own studio began to solidify from a vague hope into a tangible plan. She had found a potential space, a sunlit, slightly run-down storefront with large windows, but the financial logistics were daunting. She mentioned it to him one evening, not as a plea for help, but as a sharing of a hope. She expected encouragement, perhaps advice. What she did not expect was his reaction. Maximus listened intently, his expression unreadable. The next day he asked to see the space. He walked through the empty rooms with her, his keen business mind assessing the structure, the location, the potential. Valeria's heart sank. She saw the calculative look in his eyes, the same look he doubtless used when considering a corporate acquisition. She braced herself for him to offer to buy it for her, to solve the problem with his wealth, to turn her dream into just another one of his possessions. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to do. But he didn't. Instead, a few days later he sat her down at the kitchen table with a file. "I've spoken to the building owner," he began, his voice calm and steady, "and I've spoken with my financial manager. This is a proposal for a small business loan." He opened the file. It was not a gift. It was a formal, structured loan agreement from a private financial institution he had a stake in. The terms were incredibly favorable, the kind no bank would ever offer an unknown artist, but it was a loan nonetheless, with a clear repayment schedule. "The down payment," he continued, pointing to a number, "is exactly the amount you told me you have in your savings. The monthly payments are calculated based on what you can realistically earn from teaching classes and selling your work, with a buffer." Valeria was speechless, staring at the documents. He wasn't giving her a handout. He wasn't diminishing her achievement. He was using his power and resources not to do it for her, but to clear the path for her to do it herself. He was investing in her, not as a lover, but as a believer in her talent and her drive. It was the ultimate act of respect. The tears that filled her eyes this time were not of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming, profound gratitude. He saw her, truly saw her, and he loved her enough to make sure she remained whole, independent, and proud. That night, a fierce summer thunderstorm rolled over the city. Valeria had always been secretly terrified of lightning, a childhood fear she had never outgrown. They were in bed when a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the windows. She flinched violently, a small, terrified sound escaping her lips. Maximus, who had been drifting to sleep, was instantly awake and alert. Without a word, he pulled her tightly into his arms, wrapping the duvet around them both. He tucked her head under his chin, his large hand stroking slow, calming circles on her back. "I've got you," he whispered into her hair, his voice a low rumble that rivaled the thunder. "You're safe. I'm right here." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening boom. Valeria buried her face in his chest, but this time the fear was muted, overshadowed by the absolute safety she felt in his embrace. His body was a fortress against the storm. The sound of the rain lashing against the glass became a cocoon, sealing them in their own private world. In the warm, dark sanctuary of their bed, surrounded by the scent of him and the feeling of his strong arms holding her, the last vestiges of her old fears dissolved. The spicy, passionate connection they shared was now intertwined with this deep, abiding sense of protection and peace. She wasn't just his lover, she was his to protect, to cherish, to hold safe from all the storms both outside and within. And in that moment, wrapped in the certainty of his love, she knew with every fiber of her being that this was forever. The grand opening of the Valeria Rossi studio and gallery was a symphony of laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm, electric hum of a dream realized. The once dusty storefront was now a vibrant space, its walls adorned with Valeria's most powerful work. The stormy seas, the lonely figures now replaced by canvases filled with light and connection, and a new, breathtaking series inspired by the gray, stormy eyes of the man she loved. The room was packed, not with the cold, calculating elite of Maximus's business world, but with a lively mix of fellow artists, former catering colleagues, curious neighbors, and a few of Maximus's closest, most trusted associates who had become genuine friends. Valeria moved through the crowd, her heart feeling so full it might burst. She wore a simple, elegant dress the color of deep red wine, a gift from Maximus that he had presented without fanfare, knowing it would make her feel beautiful without overshadowing her moment. She accepted compliments and sold paintings, her smile radiant and genuine. This was hers. Every brushstroke on the walls, every scuff on the floor from moving furniture, every penny of the down payment, it was all a testament to her own strength and talent, facilitated but not diminished by the love of a remarkable man. She caught Maximus's eye across the room. He was leaning against the far wall, having politely extricated himself from a conversation, his gaze fixed solely on her. He wasn't smiling broadly, but the look in his eyes was one of such profound, unadulterated pride and love that it sent a fresh wave of warmth through her. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message that echoed through the noise. "I see you. I'm so proud of you." As the evening began to wind down, and the guests were sipping the last of their champagne, a subtle shift occurred. Maximus, after a quiet word with the small string quartet he had hired, moved to the center of the gallery. The music softened to a gentle, anticipatory hum. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to him, then to Valeria, who was standing near her favorite painting. A new piece that depicted two hands intertwined against a background of swirling, chaotic color finally resolving into a calm, unified sky. Maximus extended his hand towards her. "Valeria," he said, his voice, usually so commanding in a boardroom, was now soft, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. A flutter of nervous anticipation, sweet and sharp, danced in Valeria's stomach. She walked towards him, the crowd parting for her, their faces filled with soft smiles and knowing looks. When she reached him, he took both of her hands in his. His palms were warm and steady, a familiar anchor. He didn't get down on one knee immediately. He simply held her hands and looked into her eyes, his gaze open, vulnerable, and filled with a love so deep it was almost tangible. "When you crashed into my life," he began, a faint, fond smile touching his lips, "you shattered more than just crystal. You shattered every idea I had about what my life was supposed to be. You walked in with your fear and your honesty and your beautiful, brilliant talent, and you showed me that the empire I'd built was empty without someone to share the view with." Tears, happy and free, began to stream down Valeria's cheeks. She squeezed his hands, urging him to continue, her throat too tight to speak. "You are my second chance, Valeria. My only chance at a real, true happiness. You are my partner, my inspiration, my home." Finally, he released one of her hands and slowly, reverently, lowered himself to one knee. The collective intake of breath from their friends and family was a soft whisper in the gallery. From his pocket he produced a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was not a large, gaudy diamond, but a unique, elegant ring. The band was a twist of platinum and rose gold, and the central stone was a deep blue sapphire, the exact color of the paint she had once gotten on his shirt, surrounded by tiny, brilliant diamonds that caught the light like stars. His voice was clear and strong, filled with unwavering certainty as he looked up at her, his stormy gray eyes glistening. "I don't want a single tomorrow that doesn't have you in it. I love you. Will you marry me? Will you be my forever?" The world narrowed to this single point in time, to the man on his knee before her, to the ring that symbolized their entire journey, the chaos, the color, the night sky after the storm. There was no hesitation. There was no fear. There was only a future, bright and endless, stretching out before them. "Yes," she breathed, the word a sob of pure joy. She tugged on his hand. "Yes, Maximus. 1,000 times yes. Forever." He surged to his feet, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around as the gallery erupted into cheers and applause. He kissed her then, a deep, passionate kiss that held all the promises of their past and all the dreams of their future. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a permanent seal on their vow. Their wedding was not a society pageant. It was held in a sun-drenched garden, surrounded by the people who truly mattered. Valeria's mother beamed, her eyes full of tears. Valeria walked herself down the aisle, a vision in a simple, elegant gown, her head held high, straight into the waiting arms of her husband. Maximus's voice was thick with emotion as he recited his vows, his gaze never leaving hers. They promised each other forever, not in the naive way of storybooks, but with the hard-won certainty of two people who had found their missing piece after a long and lonely search. They built a life, not in his cold penthouse or her small studio, but in a warm, light-filled house that was a perfect blend of both their worlds. His study held his business awards next to her early, cherished sketches. Her new, larger studio had a sprawling view of the trees, and in the corner sat the first muddy brown painting he had ever attempted, framed and displayed with pride. They traveled the world, but the happiest moments were the quiet ones at home, the shared mornings, the lazy Sundays, the way he still looked at her sometimes, with that same stunned, speechless wonder he had on the night they met. Their love story was not about a billionaire and a waitress. It was about Maximus and Valeria. It was a testament to the power of a second chance, a reminder that the most beautiful connections are often born from the most unexpected collisions. It was a story of how real love doesn't ask you to be less, but empowers you to become more. It was a story of intimacy, of forever, of a promise kept. And if this story of a collision that led to a connection, of fear that transformed into forever, reminded you of the power of a second chance, then follow our journey for more tales of hearts mended and love that conquers all. Subscribe to be the first to witness our next chapter.